can assist with South Africa's economic recovery, and also UP's most recent cross-disciplinary master's degree in insolvency and business rescue. Of course, this event is brought to you by the University of Pretoria, and many of the panelists who will be joining are UP alumni. I would like to introduce our Vice Chancellor, Kupe, to introduce us to the University of Pretoria and this evening relevant discussion.
It's a very warm welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you very much for accepting to come to this debate. I know you are all very busy. Any commitment of your 5 minutes is precious time. I just wanted to say to all of you, including those who are alumni, that the University of Pretoria is in a very strong position as we speak. We've all been impacted by the pandemic, but I can assure you that we have relatively successfully weathered the storms. Also want to inform you that we're putting R1 billion of infrastructure for research and teaching, which include the following. The Future in Africa Institute and campus is about the same size as Gibbs. We have also put up Engineering 4.0, about the size of Gibbs. We've also put up a new art center, the Javed UP Art Center, which is 8 galleries in total, the largest art center you can find in your university south of the Sahara. We're also putting up another infrastructure, which is Innovation Africa at UP for digital precision agriculture, among other things. We also been able to establish ourselves very strongly in the online teaching space. So we're rolling out online programs, but we believe beyond this phase of the pandemic, we'll return to a combination of in-class teaching and hybrid teaching and learning. We also in the process of reimagining universities beyond the stage of COVID and their impact on society. We've done well on the impact rankings, 76 in infrastructure, innovation, and engineering. And so we're going to power forward to ensure South Africa is a winning nation and Africa is a prosperous, democratic, and highly modernized and equal, equitable, and sustainable continent. So thank you very much for your participation, and I look forward to your views.
Thank you very much, Professor Kupe, and also welcome to all our alumni and the whole audience from New York to Sydney, across Africa to Tshwane this evening. Without further ado, I think we have one of the most relevant panels on this topic in South Africa, and it's really an honor, firstly, to present Mr. Andre de Ruyter, Group Chief Executive at Eskom Holdings, also a brand new Interim Chief Executive Officer at South African Airways, Mr. Thomas Gokolo, Dr. Eric Levenstein, Director at Werksmans Attorneys. We have Ms. Lebogang Lepolo Pfeko, Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist at Trade Collective. Then from the University of Pretoria, we have Dr. Tshepiso Scott, a lecturer in mercantile law in the law faculty. We have Dr. Wesley Rossen-Smith, a senior lecturer in the Department of Business Management in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences. Now, South Africa has a state-to-market and back-to-state history with regards to privatization. The following quote by economist Iraj Abidjan, who in May 2016 stated that it is common knowledge that the SOEs have been the playground of patrimonial political leadership, crony capitalism, and manifest rent-seeking over the past decade. As a result, the organizational integrity has been severely compromised, their balance sheets hollowed out, and their corporate brands largely destroyed. Our focus this evening is most definitely not on all the issues we read and hear and in the Zondo Commission. We will have a constructive discussion. And the question we ask is it time to renew the 2000 to 2008 conversation around privatization of the SOEs in South Africa? And we'll kick off with a basic discussion. And Thomas, no pressure, I'll start with you. What are the drawbacks of privatization that we must be aware of?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this particular discussion. Very good discussion indeed. I think the first thing that one needs to bring to the table is that privatization is not necessarily a guarantee of success. And a couple of things that I want to highlight here as well is that in an unequal society, you tend to find that you might find the privatization situation leading to a situation where you have a concentration of power. So the few rich people who've got access to resources are the ones who are able to buy into these particular companies as well. So it is something that we need to be, aware of. One of the things about bringing, private sector into perhaps state-owned entities, you find that the profit motive becomes the primary key in terms of, strategic objectives as well. And you find that, other stakeholders tend to take a backseat, like your employees, the environment, that tends to suffer as a result of that incentive that is given to managers and shareholders. And if you look at some of the entities as well that they can be disadvantaged by, privatization, is a large part of the revenue that we generate out of state-owned entities and profits, if possible, they go back into the fiscus. And when you bring, privatization into that particular component of the governance or government, you might find yourself now being less in terms of income that you generate as a state-owned entity. Of course, this is dependent on a particular environment and particular market conditions as well. But you might be losing out as a government in a sense of revenue as well. And you might also be encouraging a huge part of inequality to continue within a society where the dominant, resource holders are the ones who participate into these equities.
Perspective, thank you. Andre, what has changed in our thinking around the concept of privatization?
I think in today's world, we've got a more nuanced approach to privatization and the involvement of the private sector. I think privatization, frankly, is a bit of a 1980s word. It's a bit of a Thatcherite concept of essentially selling off state assets and reducing state involvement in the economy. And I would agree with Thomas. I think we need to be quite nuanced when we think about the involvement of the private sector in the areas traditionally reserved for state-owned enterprises. So, for example, if one were to privatize the Eskom transmission grid, you would be privatizing a natural monopoly. And any economist would tell you that private control over a natural monopoly could lead to the extraction of monopoly rents by private actors. So one has to think very carefully how one structures state-owned enterprises to enable us to attract private capital into those areas. We know that we need, for example, in South Africa, additional electricity generation capacity, and we know that the state doesn't have the money to afford that. So how do we enable private investors to have the necessary confidence to invest in those new projects while at the same time protecting the consumer from the extraction of monopoly rents? And it's therefore, in my opinion, a very nuanced discussion, and one needs to have a balance between the unfettered pursuit of profits, the achievement of certain very worthy socioeconomic objectives, and the discipline that the profit motive of the private sector imposes on how money is spent and how businesses are run in terms of the most optimal efficiencies. So I don't think, to answer your question in brief, that this is a binary set of choices that we face. I think there's a far more modulated approach that we need to take to finding the correct balance between private sector and the state. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Andre. As academics, we ask critical questions based on science and scientific thinking. So I want to pose a question in an academic view to Lebogang and Wesley firstly. What can you add to Andre's perspective based on the most recent research findings on privatization? Lebogang, let's start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? I think basically, especially given what's been happening right now with the COVID moment and COVIDnomics, there are quite a few things that have emerged, and these include the understanding that, in fact, privatization at this time has led to a massive quite an insidious decrease in state intervention, and there's a real push towards large-scale capital investments, large-scale private capital investments. And of course, privatization has always been one of the pillars that has, against development, the idea of equitable development economics. And it was advocated as a means to reduce financial and administrative burdens of the government, because after all, the logic of Reagan and Thatcherism, as has been said, is that states are just bulky, they're just too laborious. And yet the thing that happens, of course, is that they're quite a increased standard of living often for a few is actually accompanied by the increased cost of living by the majority, and the use of fees to collect costs, of course. The social implications of all of this, because those who can afford the more costly options are going to go for that, and in a context and a situation where the world is not flat, where in fact we need to be investing more in public health, accessible health, affordable health for the majority of people, accessible and affordable education, that seems to be completely counter-logical. And I think the idea that is the only way to grow economies and is the only way to spend our way out of economic crisis. It was really put to the test by scenarios like Taiwan, for example, like Singapore, like Malaysia, and of course that privatization. It is the opposite of public accountability, and one of the disadvantages is that there's often far less public accountability. And of course, when we divert from private capital, we then oftentimes run the risk of buying over public sector assets, and economic growth could be retarded rather than being expanded.
Thank you, Lebogang. Wesley, your work is grounded in the business sciences. What's your opinion? Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. There's a lot of research on the topic of privatization. What we're seeing of late is that there's growing empirical research that suggests that the association between privatization and better performing companies, profitability, that's quite a strong correlation that's taking place there. We also see that with state-owned entities that have been distressed for long periods of time and are exposed to quite competitive environments, when they privatize, they emerge actually creating jobs rather than the idea of actually losing jobs in the process of privatization. So although we have this idea that privatization will always lead to job losses, in some circumstances it actually leads to job creation. Also what we see in terms of a lot of studies that have come out is that we see a general trend towards using economic mechanisms to drive customer welfare, and also objectives to be achieved in terms of employment and industrialization. In terms of the general trend across the board, in terms of issues across state-owned enterprises, there's definitely, right across the board, there's this issue around corporate governance, as well as politicalization in terms of affecting state-owned entities, and also the lack of clear objectives. So having said that, that's kind of what's emerging out of the literature at the moment. What we also see is that although these challenges that SOEs are facing, in particular in South Africa, that these are quite surmountable challenges, and that sometimes we resort to privatization in desperation because of these sort of challenges that they're facing.
Thank you, Wes. So, Piso, from a legal point of view, from your world, how might privatization have an impact on vulnerable consumers, potentially?
Thanks for the question. So I think we'd have to, as a first step, define what we're talking about when we refer to vulnerable consumers. And vulnerable consumers would probably, encompass a large majority of the South African population, because here we're talking about people who live in low-income areas. We're talking about people who are illiterate or not fluent in particular languages. We're talking about people who live in low density or rural areas. We're also talking about people who are vulnerable by virtue of their age. So perhaps they are minors or they are people who are overage. And in this respect, there are a number of SOEs which either directly or indirectly service this group of vulnerable consumers. So, for instance, if we look at a state-owned entity such as PRASA, it provides transportation services, and the bulk of the persons who would use the service are vulnerable consumers. PRASA at this stage, for instance, is already, as with many other SOEs, is facing challenges in terms of its governance and its efficiency. And the people who are being impacted on the most are the vulnerable consumers. And if you look at it from an international perspective, in some other developing countries, such as Bangladesh, which have gone from nationalization through to privatization and have seen some of the challenges and pitfalls in either regimes, one thing, although there are definitely some challenges that come with privatization, one thing that seems to be constant when there is an element of privatization is that the unit price of goods and services tends to decrease, obviously resulting from an increase in competition, which would be to the benefit of these people who are vulnerable consumers. So the impact, the possible impact of privatization would actually be that it might be positive for a vulnerable consumer in that they might have more competitive pricing, the quality of the goods and services they get might be better, and they would also be able to exercise their rights as consumers to choose their particular goods and services as opposed to being limited by a set SOE that is providing that particular good or service.
Thank you. I think we'll address this again in our open discussion. I can see some of the panel members are really interested to respond to that. Lebogang, I want to take this back to you as an economist. What is the current economic position of SOEs, and how will their performance impact the economic recovery of South Africa?
Thanks for that. Look, SOEs have been performing badly for the last while. I mean, I think in brief, we know that in the last budget, for example, there was a 3 billion rand allocation to the land bank, and in the MTBS as well, it was indicated that there'd be an additional 7 billion to support the restructuring of that particular entity. And it's an ongoing trend across, whether it's the Road Accident Fund, it's Eskom, it's Transnet, it's South African Airways, it's Denel, and so forth. And I think that what this leads to is really a couple of things. At their best, state-owned enterprises should play an important role. They should be able to, firstly, ensure equitable and really efficient and predictable public service, right? So some public services are particularly significant because there's the public interest related, and running those in a commercial way would run the risk, of course, of then hampering that public provision. So radio, access to radio, TV, railways, the postal services, name them. I think another part of that is it's also part of protecting our national resources and also our state security. Because to a great extent, it is useful for our, for key sectors of the economy and state-owned entities to be housed, as it were, in an anchor that is state-defined and which is subject to particular parameters. And of course, the question, which is quite controversial in some quarters, but as a development and political economist, I think that taking control of currency and banking is one of the important functions that they can potentially play. And in fact, in relation to then industrializing states and an industrializing country, such as what South Africa is, contrary to being lumped as a middle income country, which is quite problematic. This means that then much further, much more effective industrialization is possible. And I think that can potentially lead to unemployment being assuaged. But we're living in a country, in a context where our problems with unemployment are much deeper than here and now, right? They're intergenerational, they're structural, and they need they need, it's about a distribution, a redistribution, a reconfiguration of access to equity, of access of power, and different forms of economic modeling, stabling, prices as well, stabling products and food production and food costs and all of these. And we've seen all the scandals over the past few years around, food price fixing and the collusion between some of the supermarkets and the larger retail companies who really all should know better, and how that effectively your old boards, your old food boards and your old state, which were also state-owned entities, can about. And lastly, that this also is a really important way of enabling domestic markets, domestic producers to able to have a guaranteed inbuilt market, which will not be priced out of existence by very cheap imports and sometimes sub-quality imports.
Thank you, Lebogang. Again, like Andre and Thomas said, a balanced, nuanced view. Eric, I want to get to on a business level. You have vast experience in the turnaround world, in the SOE sector as well. Do you think privatization can be used as a turnaround strategy for SOEs?
Most definitely, Alex. And I must say that, I've monitored the SOEs as a restructuring lawyer involved in business rescue for some years now. And when you look at this morning's application that was mentioned in the press, where NUMSA are in fact launching an application to the Constitutional Court asking government to step in, and a ruling that the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, SCOPA, in fact, are being asked to monitor and oversee insolvency and liquidation of SOEs. I think it'll be a very interesting application. What the outcome might be, we'll have to wait and see. But a lot of mention there of Denel, of SA Express, which is in provisional liquidation, and we'll have to see where that application lands up. I think that turnaround strategies, and particularly the use of business rescue, has been to a large degree pushed into the background until we saw the SAA filing on the 5th of December 2019. As I said earlier, I've been writing articles and following the state of SOEs for some time now. And there's been a strong call to use the business rescue mechanism, or the turnaround mechanism, to in fact convert SOEs maybe into private companies, or at least use it as a tool or mechanism to privatize these companies. And I think there is a lot to be said for that, particularly when one looks at boards of directors who are trading companies potentially in insolvent circumstances, and when they might be financially distressed, and where potentially they might be opening themselves up to personal liability claims for trading a company in those circumstances. So I think the push really, where we saw SAA into business rescue, was very much driven by board concerns in relation to potential liability issues. And then, of course, all of that came to head when we saw SAA file in December 2019. And I just want to say that the privatization debate has been looked at very carefully by the business rescue practitioners of SAA. I know that the plan was filed, and I do know that the company has exited from business rescue, and we'll talk a little bit more about SAA just now. But at the end of the day, there is an opportunity to file a business rescue plan, at least offer some portion of government equity to, let's say, a strategic equity partner, get them to come into the mix, maybe assist with operations and move it forward. Now, I'm not saying this applies to every SOE. It certainly was looked at SAA. Potentially, maybe Denel would be looked at on that basis. SA Express recently reported also looking at potential strategic equity partners. So really, Alex, for me as a restructuring professional or lawyer looking at this every day, I do believe that if careful consideration is given to the business rescue process, as we have seen in South African Airways, potentially we can use this as a mechanism going forward for privatization.
Thank you, Eric. Tsepiso, linked to what Eric just mentioned, the consumer is still one of the key stakeholders here. How do we address efficiency concerns without prejudicing vulnerable consumers?
Thank you for the question. So I think at the core of efficiency issues in most of our state-owned entities is the issue of bad corporate governance, or lack of observation of good corporate governance practices. And I can come back to the Bangladesh example. When they started off with their nationalization journey, a lot of their SOEs became loss-making concerns, and this was due to corporate governance-related issues. So their management was not properly trained. They had excessive overstaffing. They had rigid wage structures. The SOEs also tended to thrive on huge subsidies from the state. And this really resulted in the national economy becoming strained and increasing corruption in Bangladesh. So the issue of bad corporate governance in the context of SOEs is not particularly unique to the South African context. It is something that we've seen happening in other jurisdictions, but I do not think that corporate governance needs to be addressed in SOEs alone. It's an issue that needs to be addressed in SOEs and the private role players that might come together in whatever structure or nuanced approach in order to give better services to vulnerable consumers. So in terms of how we can actually practically address these issues of efficiency, it would mean actually looking at the mechanisms that we already have in place and implementing them. So for instance, looking into the King IV Code of Corporate Governance would mean that we need to make sure that in these boards of our SOEs, as well as the private entities, the board members need to be suitably qualified. They need to have the relevant experience. There needs to be a culture of good corporate governance that is cultivated with good ethics as well in that particular entity. And all of these things would contribute towards making sure that the entities are run more efficiently and sustainably, because the directors need to be aware of their duty to be good corporate citizens by making sure that they adhere to the laws that bind them individually, but also the laws that bind the specific SOE that they are heading up. Another example would be making sure that we actually enforce the mechanisms that we already have at our disposal. So, for instance, the Companies Act provides shareholders with the possibility of removing directors from boards subject to certain processes that are set out in Section 71. So instead of waiting for a company to be run to the ground before taking action against an individual director, the shareholders should rather take that into account and enforce those mechanisms so that the organizations can be run efficiently and sustainably, which ultimately would benefit the vulnerable consumer.
Thank you. Now let's fly back to the SAA. Thomas, this is probably an unfair question. It's early days for you, and it's quite complex, I know. Would privatization or a form of privatization, as you've mentioned, have assisted in the multiple failed turnaround strategies of SAA that they've attempted over the past few years?
Look, it's difficult to give a definite answer, but when you look at the environment that SAA plays in, for example, yes, in South Africa, it appears to be a big airline, but when you put it into the global, aviation market, it's a relatively small entity. And the way it has been set up to compete in the international market, one can then say that it was from a commercial point of view. You're coming in small, and the aviation market are for the guys who've got the sheet, the guys who can be able to put in and accommodate a lot of cost in their business model. And unfortunately, those costs don't generally lead to high profit margins. I mean, the margins are very low in the aviation space. So you're putting in a lot of cost and you're not getting a good return out of the margins. So it means that as a government, I don't think even beyond SAA, the government itself had the necessary balance sheet to compete in the global space. And that's why one can make a good case for privatization, especially now when you see with COVID and you look at who is flying. Those who've got deep pockets are flying because now we're competing on who can burn cash the most. And I think you can hear from the previous speakers as well that the government is tired of burning cash around some of these entities as well. So for SAA, one can make a case of privatization going forward because of the strained fiscal position of our government and also that desire to continue competing in the market because I think we've got a good brand as well. There's quite loyalty in the market as well. And there's still opportunities, to generate revenue out of the aviation market as well. But in its current form, I think we won't be able to compete. You need a bit of, not even a bit of support, a support base. And the support that comes from private sector could be in this format. It could be money on the starting point so that at least you go to the market with a strong balance sheet. But the current environment suggests that we will need more collaboration and more networks. So if you've got a private, equity holder coming and bringing in addition to money, bringing in the network, that allows you to at least position yourself and take advantage of the international markets through various networks that you can get. And more importantly as well, as markets get more tougher, you need those particular expertise in your management or in your leadership as well. And if you get in private sector that are competent and have got the expertise and experience of working around aviation sector as well, you stand a better chance to compete in the market as well. So you need that balance sheet. You need the expertise coming through as well. And you need to be able to collaborate with various countries so that you can then take advantages of load factors that we normally talk about when we talk about the aviation sector as well. So for me, looking at the past is very difficult because one was not involved. But if you look at where we are going future-wise, I think it will be good to find ourselves having a strategic equity partner that can beef up areas where we are lagging behind. And I think it will add a great value to the business that we have, because if you look at some of the local airlines that we are competing in, they are private sector backed. It's very difficult to compete with them because they can be able to burn more cash than you do. If you go into the international market, these guys are burning cash in dollars, and you're bringing rands in there. You're not going to do much because then you're going to overprice yourself out of the market. You're going to overprice yourself. You don't have the balance sheet to buy modern aircrafts as well. So it puts you at a disadvantage to compete internationally. So the best thing to do is to try and get your balance sheet boosted by getting your private sector players in there, so that at least you can then be able to compete commercially. So a commercial modeling in an airline, quite a tough one. And I think this is where the role of private sector can really assist greatly in making sure that we thrive as a national carrier. Thank you.
Very good answer. Thank you, Thomas. Wesley, do you want to comment on that?
Thanks, Alex.
Can you comment on that?
Well, I'm so grateful for Thomas's answer, because I do agree with him. I just want to take one step back, is that when one of the things we teach in turnaround management is that, first of all, a complete turnaround doesn't take place in business rescue. For all intents and purposes, business rescue is your quick and dirty. It's your triage for distressed companies. The aim of it is to stabilize the company and get it so that it can just operate at a certain level. That business rescue then forms part of a greater turnaround strategy, which is most likely to take place over a 5 to 6 year period. And during the next couple of years is really where I think a company like SAA is going to enact its full turnaround plan into its environment. Having said that, though, one needs to also make a distinction between the causes and symptoms of distress. For all intents and purposes, the financial woes SAA has found itself in are the symptoms of distress, and the causes of that distress really come from more deep-rooted issues. And that may link itself to numerous issues that, in terms of political intertwined goals, might be slowed stakeholder decision making, and all of that might contributing to that sort of those issues. So I think in that respect, I think I do agree that privatization is a tool that can be used quite effectively here. Also, as a rule of thumb, when it comes to companies that have a clear task and objectives, and you can reward those objectives clearly, that makes a good candidate for privatization. The private sector does well at that. In SAA's case, it's a company that is it should be profit driven. It has a defined business model, and I think in respect to that, it makes a good candidate for the private sector to be run in the private sector. A last point is in terms of association with job losses. I think the bulk of the job losses on SAA's side has taken place. Numerous routes have been closed down, and I think a more competitive entity would be able to expand the company, grow the company to newer routes, and that will just create more jobs. So I think that from my side, I do agree with Thomas. Privatization is a very good solution in that particular case.
Thank you, Wesley. Thomas, I think you just missed your GIP students there with that. that comment on strategy and so on. Andre, you in a totally different world and industry, but do you think privatization or a form of that could assist your efforts in turning around Eskom as compared to SAA?
If you define privatization as the selling off of state-owned assets, then one's got to look at the quality of the assets. So if you know of any investor who wants to buy a 40-year-old power station that hasn't been well maintained, that requires extensive investment in environmental mitigation in order to remain compliant, that requires huge maintenance expenditure going forward, and that has 10 years left to run. I'd be very interested in meeting such an investor, because I think that it's fundamentally not a sellable asset. And that is part of the reason why the Eskom roadmap that was developed by the Department of Public Enterprises is aimed at creating an environment in which we can replace those aging assets with new private sector funded and operated generation assets. So again, rather than selling the family silver, such as it is, tarnished in many respects, we would see a gradual move to greater involvement by the private sector in those areas where the private sector can and should play a role, and where the efficiencies that can be unlocked by the private sector can in fact be delivered. And I come back to the example of certain parts of the business that, in my view, should not be privatized, because it would turn a natural monopoly from a state-owned one into a private-held monopoly. And one would need to have extraordinary regulation in order to prevent that monopoly from being abused by a profit-seeking private sector. And I'm all for profits in the private sector, don't get me wrong. I'm not a foam-at-the-mouth socialist by any stretch of the imagination. But one's got to get the right model for a particular economic scenario. And where there is competition possible, and where there is a need for greater efficiency driven by the private sector, absolutely, let's work for that. But the simplistic model of selling off state-owned assets in a fire sale and expecting somehow the private sector wanting to come in and not insist, for example, on significant increases in electricity tariffs that would be required to fund a 10-year return, I think is wishful thinking with respect.
Thank you, Andre. That links to what Tsepiso said about the consumer as well. Eric, I can see you want to comment on what Andre just said.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. And very interesting to hear your views and, of course, Thomas's views. And I think really it comes down to the issue of different assets. I mean, you can't really compare an Eskom to a South African Airways. And I've also been quite involved in the business rescue of Kome, a private company, obviously now invested with investors coming in the rescue, and hopefully, that will eventually exit. So I think it really is not a case that privatization can work in every single SOE. It might work in a Denel, it might work in an SA Express, might certainly not work in an Eskom. But what was very interesting for me is that SAA was a pilot test case. And in fact, the closest I think we've ever come to see an SOE being privatized. Now, Thomas might tell us, and I'm sure he's not going to tell us on this forum, that there is a strategic equity partner in the wings, excuse the pun, and we will eventually get there. But I don't think that it's the same fit for everybody. What is interesting for me is that SAA, I think, was the first SOE that actually handed over the reins, the control, to an independent party, and that was the business rescue practitioner. Now, the jury's out as to whether or not the rescue process worked. Will it work going forward? Will government continue to fund? Will SA, eventually fly in the next few months? We'll have to wait and see. But I think really at the end of the day, it comes down to who is the shareholder, what is the asset that's up for, let's say, sale, or the equity that's up for sale, what's the interest in the market, and certainly business rescue and turnaround strategies, as Wesley has said, can convert if there's a willingness and certainly an ability by the practitioner to get through the hoops to, in fact, privatize financially distressed SOEs.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Eric. Thank you, Andre. And now for a panel question. I think we have about 5 minutes for that, as we have thousands of questions from our audience across the world, which we'll have probably time for 3 of them. The one was, Andre, why did you take that position? That's the question there, but I'm just joking. What would the impact of not entertaining the conversation be? If we don't entertain these discussions, looking at industry and academic and science and so on. So what would the impact of not entertaining this conversation be? Tapiso, can I start with you maybe?
Sure. So I think the first impact, and obviously it will be industry specific, as people have already indicated, would be on the consumer, the vulnerable consumer, who needs to receive services from an entity that is properly functioning, services that it actually has a choice or suppliers that. Sorry, in the sense that it also has suppliers from which it can choose to provide specific services. And if we don't have a privatization conversation, it means that the people who are suffering, being the majority of South Africans, are basically left out in the cold. It also means that our economy continues to suffer, especially if there are continuous bailouts for SOEs that are not able to stand on their own too.
Thank you. Lebogang? If we don't entertain this discussion, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think the one is basically that it runs the risk of us becoming very linear and very parochial in our thinking. So suggesting and implying that there's only one way or 2 ways to do things and to think things out. And one thing that we're very good at in this country, there's an immense talent for conceptualizing, designing, imagining policy, but perhaps not quite the same talent for being agile and nimble, responsive when policies are not having the desired effect, or just the circumstances beyond our control, the need to shift. And what this conversation and conversations like it on the different forms of economic remodeling and economic reimagining is the opportunity for that kind of nimbleness, and also intersectional conversations with perhaps stakeholders and players who may not always agree on everything all the time, but are willing to converge and diverge when necessary in the interest of nation building.
Absolutely. Eric?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think that what is interesting for me getting out of this conversation, or getting out these points, is that I think at the end of the day, we have to have this conversation. And it really is about translating the upside of privatization into either operational support or financial support. And whether or not the company can do it on its own, or whether there needs to be a formal intervention like a restructuring or business rescue mechanism, it depends on the particular SOE. And I think the opportunity for privatization in SOEs is completely industry agnostic. As I said to Andre and to Thomas earlier on, it really is completely dependent on the asset, on the willingness of the board and the shareholder to basically put the privatization model in place.
Thomas?
Thank you. I mean, these are good conversations because the environment that we find ourselves in and the state of our SOEs will require us to have these kind of robust conversations, out of the box type of thinking, so that we can position ourselves correctly as a country and more as a continent into the rest of the world. And as we have said as well, this gives us an opportunity to see which asset is really good for privatization and which asset is not. And that's a very important conversation as well that we are having today. So I think this is good, and it should continue as well as we seek to find more solutions to the problems that we have in our SOEs, and also promoting and encouraging private sector engagement into finding solution to help the government as well.
Thank you. Wesley.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Alex. I actually want to build on what Thomas just said. In terms of, if you think all our SOEs were set up under strategic objectives of the country almost 30 to 50 years ago. And, I think the danger of not entertaining this conversation is foregoing the opportunities within our new strategic objectives as a country. We need to be able to talk and understand which SOEs are still relevant today, which ones should we reposition, which new opportunities should we be looking at for new SOEs, and then once again, also entertain the conversation around closing SOEs or selling them off. There's very few organizations today few organizations that can stay relevant forever.
Thank you, Wesley. Andre, last remark there.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to pick up on a point that Chipisa made about vulnerable consumers, and I think that's something that in our country in particular is highly relevant. 13% of South Africans today are not connected to the electricity grid. So that's about, 4.5 million people that don't have access to electricity. And when you think of electricity being synonymous with development and with dignity, I think it's a very important issue to also talk about the social mandate of state-owned enterprises. I don't think we should forget that. And we need to understand what a privatized entity will do to fulfill that social mandate. Otherwise, as Chipisa quite correctly points out, those vulnerable consumers will be left behind. So I think that, again, the opportunity that we've got is to introduce greater business acumen into our SOEs. One of the strengths of, I think, in particular, the US economy is that there's a regular interchange between business and government. So the two parties understand one another very well. There's an understanding in government of the profit motive and in business of the regulatory impetus. Now, these two factions obviously don't always get along very well, and there's a lot of dynamics that manifest themselves in party politics. But that understanding in the state apparatus of how a business should be run is something that I think would be very valuable to improving the performance of our SOEs. And we should, I think, introduce more people with a business track record to go and work in SOEs, because I think that some of those private sector efficiencies can then be driven and introduced with positive impacts on the ailing state of some of our SOEs.
Excellent. Thank you, Andre. Very good remark on competence and skills. Now from the audience, I've selected 3 of them because we have about 6 minutes left. The first one is posed to Andre and Thomas specifically. And maybe Lebogang, you can add to the answer. Should our level of competing globally be one of the major reasons for SOE privatization? Should our level of competing globally be one of the major reasons for SOE privatization? Thomas, you can
I go first on that one? Yeah, I think you can't ignore the ability to compete globally. We are in a very interconnected world. We play a role in a global stage, and if we can, leverage on some of the expertise and the capabilities of our SOEs to compete in the world, we are able to generate revenue. For example, in the case of SAA, if we are able to compete in the regional markets, that is the continent itself, and we are able to transport people between, whether it's Nigeria, Ghana, Malawi, and all that, that allows us to grow our economy as well while we are competing as well. And then internationally as well, there is quite a lot of opportunities in the aviation sector. So here the government has got a particular asset that they can definitely use to compete in the world, and it does allow us to be able to do that. So it is something that we can ignore, and it's got a significant contribution in terms of privatization indeed, because once you go internationally, you need to have the big bucks to be able to play on that stage.
Absolutely, especially in your industry. Andre?
Yeah, I think that the opportunity that we've got with accessing global markets, that is clearly significantly improved. You know, when Eskom was founded 98 years ago by Dr. Hendrik van der Bijl, it was with the explicit mandate to provide cheap electricity to South African industry to make them competitive and to enable industrialization. I think the world's moved on. I don't think that cheap electricity as a tool of industrial policy is sustainable anymore, particularly since we see global phenomena like the EU contemplating the imposition of a carbon export tax on manufactured goods from a country with a very high carbon footprint. So that means South Africa, and with the EU being a major trading partner, that could turn an ostensible competitive advantage into a very real disadvantage. So I think, again, the opportunity for us to compete has to be founded in market economics. One cannot subsidize your way out of a lack of competitiveness. And I think that is where market forces have to play a role to ensure that there is some healthy form of creative destruction that takes place in an economy on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. Lebogang.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it depends. I think when we say competing globally, firstly, we probably need to problematize that, because I think that we do spend quite a bit of time over obsessing about global as in European, Euro-Asian, North American, and less time investing perhaps in infrastructure. And one would like to think that if that was the direction that we're going, that would open huge opportunities and massive, a huge shift in what we think of as value chain addition, especially because we only compete, as you know, we only trust ourselves around 10% or so, unlike a South Asia, which is about 57%, the European Union, which is extremely integrated at about 80%, Latin America slightly less so at about 38%, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that if that's the kind of globe that we're thinking of, then there's a lot to be said for it. But I also think that we should be careful not to overstate the idea that, in fact, privatizing state-owned enterprises is the way to open up markets and also the way to open up the economy, because, of course, you're always going to be this strange but inevitable balancing act between short-term shareholder interests and kind of more long-term intergenerational economic dividends, which are much harder to measure and which don't quickly. And if we think that, of course, individual shareholders may not necessarily have the incentive to monitor and to discipline management on their own, state-owned enterprises might be easier to monitor rather if proper mechanisms and controls are put in place. Whether that's in the hands of private control per se, I think is subject to great debate.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that question? Let me rather ask the next one and the last one. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. It's such an interesting and insightful discussion. Someone from the audience asked, does the state invest in education a lot? And this links to what Andre said about skills and competence, acumen, business acumen. We invest in education, but a chunk of those end up in the private sector. What will SOEs do to bring back the youth to work after studying, after school, to work for SOEs? Thomas or Andre, anyone? Thomas, let's start again with you.
I'll start again. I don't think the statement is necessarily true. From my experience in the state-owned entities, we've got a lot of youth that are participating as from an internship point of view, graduate programs, we do have that. I think the question is more making state-owned entities much more attractive to the youth to come into them as a state of, as a place of employment. And having had all the contribution, What we need to be doing on our side is to make sure that there is an image of clean governance. There is an image of high performance. We need to achieve the result, basically attain the mandate that we've been established for. And I think that will create much more interest from the youth in terms of joining a state-owned entity, because then you can be groomed there, you can be into an environment that has got a culture of high performance. And I think it's our role as the leaders of the state-owned entities to create those particular environment, and more importantly, be able to nurture the talents that comes out of universities as well, and tertiary institutions.
Thank you. That's really good news, especially your very last remark there. Andre?
Yeah, thanks. I think the opportunity that, excuse me, that we've got to attract young people is that we have to play to the millennial appetite for work of a higher purpose. And being the father of 3 millennials, I think I've got a fairly good idea of what drives them. So I think if we can provide in Eskom, for example, a future that is cleaner, greener, that involves addressing some of the big social and environmental issues that we as a nation and as a planet face, I think in my experience, people find that very attractive and very engaging. It's not necessarily about who pays the most money, it's also who does the most meaningful work. And we've certainly been successful in attracting some highly talented youngsters based on that premise, and I think we'll be able to continue to do so going forward.
Thank you. That's really good news for us as well. You know, at University of Pretoria, we drive the future of work in our curricula, in our research. And I quickly want to ask the 2 lecturers here, Wesley and Tsepiso, what do you think? Are we preparing the youth to work in the SOEs? Do we offer them the skills development to enable them to contribute, especially in terms of business and management acumen? Wesley?
I think, Alex, I think we do. To a large extent, and the reason is that for the last 5-6 years, our degrees, especially on the business management side, has been emphasizing more and more on leadership components, governance policies, and we would like to believe that us having that played such a huge role in our curriculum, that is producing students that can go into these SOEs and like Andre explained, are working for a higher purpose, and that they're not just there for a salary. And so I think to a large extent we have done this, but obviously there's also a lot more room for improvement.
Great, thank you. Tsepiso?
Yes, I agree with Wesley. I think that we are doing so in including things like corporate governance, including things like the mechanisms that are available in terms of the Companies Act, how state-owned entities function, how they should be functioning. All those are things that we do, communicate to the students, and it's skills that we transfer to them, and hopefully they'll be able to then use them in the SOEs that they might potentially join in the future.
Thank you very much. In fact, next week we have a Nobel laureate dialogue on the future of work, and I'm inviting all of you to listen and participate. We're really looking forward to discuss the future of work. Thank you very much. That was an hour. That was really quick and one of the best panel sessions in a long time. I would like to thank our panel, Andre, Thomas, Eric, Debogang, Wesley, and Tsepiso. And specifically, Andre and Thomas, good luck with a very, very difficult and complex position you fill. We support you all the way, and thank you for writing case studies for our students, especially in strategy and many fields. And looking forward to contribute in terms of our end product working for you and assisting and building those entities positively. Thank you. And then we want Prof. Kupi, do you want to contribute towards the end of this hour? Prof.
Just to say thank you very much to all of the panelists. Much appreciated. Yes, what you say today, some people charge for as a speech over dinner, talks for cash. But you gave our students, our alumni, lots to think about and very deeply. We need more of these debates in South Africa. Our media is no longer what it should be. It's a topic for another day. We will mount it up. But I also want particularly to say, The continent, the country, and the world will not develop without these kind of critical debates where what people don't take just simple black and white positions. These things are very nuanced. They require critical thought. They require very serious reflection. I just like also to add my word around the Nobel Dialogue. So we'll have 5 Nobel Prize winners for the first time for a Nobel Dialogue on the continent. As Alex said, the topic is future of work. It's multidimensional. It's not just about technological disruption. So please tune in. If you can't, we're recording everything and we will send you the links posted. So it's from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. on the 18th of May. So please enjoy, and you will be back because this is not over by any means. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Prof. Coupe, and I agree with you. We've just opened this discussion, and we'll continue. Thank you very much, and enjoy your evening.